Hey everyone, it's so great to be here and be a part of this phenomenal conference and movement. Thanks, Women in Product in particular, for bringing all of us together for these 2 days. Very excited. This is the first time I'm at the conference. I'm here today to talk to you about scaling product management from startups to big tech. Through this talk, I hope to give you a perspective on what it's like to be a product manager on both ends of the scale spectrum, right? So whether you're at a startup or at a big tech company or just looking to pivot, I'm hoping that through this talk, you'll be able to really see what some of the nuances between these two sizes of organizations are. So before we get started, and as we're settling in, I'd love to know the backgrounds and mix of people here. So go ahead and drop in the chat if you currently work or have mostly worked in the past in startups or in big tech. Just feel free to use those two phrases. I'll give you a few seconds here while we get those in. Cool. And keep those coming, but let's get started. So, to kick things off, a little about myself. My name is Apporva, and I live in Los Angeles. My background is deeply in technology. So, after completing my undergrad and master's in computer science back in 2014, I joined a really fun small startup called Signeasy as a developer. A year or so in, though, I saw this shiny new object in product management back in 2015 and decided to give it a shot. So, takeaway number one right there, one of the perks of being in a startup is that they were very, very willing to take a shot on me. So, a great way to pivot into product management if you're at that stage. Anyway, I spent another 4 years or so at that same startup, ultimately heading product and growth for them. So, really was able to rapidly climb that ladder per se. And that's your takeaway number two. Startups are a great spot to do that and really short circuit the role level climb within the company. So if that's something that really drives you and motivates you. Well, after that, I moved to LA to pursue an MBA at UCLA Anderson. And through my MBA, I wanted to pivot into big tech in a product management role. So I was sort of curious about what it's like to be on this other side, just as you are. And I did that. I ended up joining Amazon in the role of senior product manager at Amazon Music. And I work with the amazing podcast team. So, just to preface my perspective so far on what it's like to be a PM at a startup and at big tech, especially when it comes to skills, because we'll be talking a lot about skills. I'd start off with this illustration here, which I really like. The way I interpret it is that we hear a lot in the first few years, especially in this role, I certainly did, about how product management is this perfect intersection of design, engineering, and business. And frankly, that's how I used to perceive it as well when I made the pivot from engineering to product. I was under the impression that I needed to be really, really good at all these three things to be a great product manager. Over time, though, I realized, I need a lot more skills than just those three. But more importantly, that great product managers don't really worry about how well balanced they are with their skills. It's possible and probably more likely that you are stronger in one suit versus the other, or you work in an environment that demands you to be better skilled at one versus the other. So you end up exercising one muscle over the other. In my perspective, what's more important than having this perfect balance of all the skills and putting all of your energy in trying to balance these skills out is knowing your strengths and weaknesses, really. Acknowledging that you still bring a lot to the table. We all know about the infamous imposter syndrome here. And then employing the sum of all those skills that you have in whatever varying degree of strength to operate in this intersection of building the best product for the right customer. And that, frankly, I think is the essence of product management across companies, right? Startups or big tech or whatever size it might be. So skills are important. Well, of course they are. Any company of any size looks for certain skills to assess if you'll be successful in your role. But I don't think it's just about that when you're trying to figure out what kind of a product manager you want to be or where you want to work. I think looking beyond just skills, in my experience, Product management at a startup and big tech can be largely compared and contrasted along three broad pillars here. So they are, of course, the skills that we talked about that you come in with or develop and will need to be successful. But the environment of the job itself and the impact it will ultimately have your career and your growth are also important. We PMs love a good framework, right? So you can sort of look at this as a three-step process where the skills are the inputs, which are all applied and processed at the job, and the output is the impact it has on you. And obviously, there may be other characteristics not cleanly captured here, but I think this provides a good lens through which we can have this conversation today. So, how would you use this? Well, if you are somebody who is a PM at a big tech company today, you may use this framework to sort of look through the window to the other side to see, okay, what skills do I already have that I can leverage at a startup? What skills I can expect to develop while I'm working at the startup? What's it even going to be like on the job? And vice versa for someone who is at a startup today looking to pivot into big tech. So I have here a list of the key skills, job characteristics, and the impact working in a startup has had on my career, as well as big tech on the next screen. In the interest of time, I won't go through everything here. I have made this available as handouts, so you can take a look later if you'd like. But to illustrate the differences, I wanted to talk through a couple of points for each of the skills, job, and impact pillars. So, starting off with skills, I thought strategic thinking would be an interesting one to talk about. In startups, as a PM, more often than not, you'll find yourself thinking about strategy in a much shorter horizon. So, maybe a year, or even shorter sometimes, depending on the stage of the startup. You would have a product vision, which may be more long term and aspirational and more looking into the future, but your actual product strategy, which would consider in what space you want to compete and how you want to compete, right? So that includes your competitive environment, your competitive advantage, who are the customers you will be building your product for, etc. That will be built out over a shorter horizon. And that's usually because of the nature of startups, right? It makes sense. There are a lot of there are a lot of uncertainties, a lot more flux, and you want to be iterative and be set up to react fast to changes and wouldn't want to commit or plan beyond a certain time frame. It's almost impossible to do that. In contrast, you think more long term in big tech companies, right? So you may be working on features that will be built out over the whole year and sometimes over into the next year or over multiple years. And you could be handling multiple such features. Your product strategy overall is over a much longer horizon. And they're typically driven top down as well. It's easier to imagine that there would be a top level company strategy, which trickles down into the different business layers and ultimately informs your own product strategy. So there's less room for flux, there's more certainty, and as a result, you operate over a much longer time frame. Now, the second skill I wanted to draw your attention to is analytical ability, right? It's one of the most common PM skills across the board and something you definitely need to be successful in any kind of a job environment. And a lot of things say the same, right? Be it any size of organization. You have to be curious about data. You have to use data to guide your decisions. It's not purely based on gut, etc. But in my experience, there's a nuance here. So in startups, you frequently find yourself starting at zero, right? As true with many other things at work, with working in a startup. So with data, you have to define what data to even track, right? And that's where your analytical ability can come in. You have to figure out how you will measure things, what tools to use even, how you will report things, how you will use the information, right? How will you spread that information across the startup? And while that may be true in a big tech company as well, you can easily find yourself in a situation in big tech where you are inundated with data points and various dashboards, right? So some old, some new, built over time for different purposes. And you sort of find yourself sifting through to figure out what data is even relevant. And it's a simple difference, but it may be a completely different muscle that you haven't had to use yet. So I thought that was pretty interesting when I noticed it, and thought it'd be nice to talk about that. Okay, so moving on to job, I think these are pretty self-explanatory, not as enlightening or unexpected. But in startups, you can expect high cross-functional collaboration. As a PM, you may find yourself working across all functions of the org constantly, right? Engineering and design, of course, but also marketing, sales, customer success, even HR if you are involved in hiring. And these conversations are highly related to the feature or product or even team that you're building. In big tech companies, your circle is usually not as broad. So, engineering, definitely. Design, most likely. Marketing, maybe. And then it usually dwindles out. Cross functional conversations are happening usually at a much higher leadership level. I will say, though, that due to its size, you're likely going to be interacting with more people within the same role in big tech. So interacting a lot with a lot more engineers, more designers, with different kinds of skill sets, etc., which is obviously a new experience in its own right, and pretty interesting to experience. And the second nature of the job that I find interesting is how decisions are made, right? In startups, it's usually a lot more unstructured, a lot more ad hoc. You use frameworks where relevant or as needed. Some might decide not to use it altogether, and the focus is mostly on moving rapidly and delivering results. In big tech companies, decision making processes are a lot more structured. Amazon, for instance, has a pretty well known decision making framework called Type 1 and Type 2 decisions that are widely used in the company. One of the reasons for that is when you build products at that scale, when there are so many people involved, when there are so many points of decisions, you need to help people make consistent decisions and repeatedly. And a framework that everybody can use sort of helps provide that and anchors people into sort of the same guidelines. And finally, the biggie, the impact startups and big tech can have on your career and growth. And this is what all of this is about. This is a little bit of a nod to my computer science background, but I see skill development to be breadth first or depth first in nature, right? So in startups, the skills that you develop are usually broad in nature. So you do a lot of things, even beyond product management sometimes, and are exposed to a variety of skills and capabilities. You will likely not become an expert at each of them, of course, but you will be made aware and you will see them in action. So, for instance, at the startup I worked at, I was pretty involved in conversations around marketing channels, positioning and messaging, sales strategies, and even building out product promotional videos, right? So I really had a front row seat to a lot that goes on behind the scenes or across other functions. But in big tech, it's very much depth first skill development. And this sort of alludes to my earlier point about collaboration. Because I'm interacting closely with a tighter net of functions and focusing more on a particular problem set, it allows me to really hone and develop the craft of building products. So the skills that I end up using and developing, really, I iterate over it and build it in depth rather than having a breadth of skills. And this very nicely sort of segues into my second point on impact here. I'll start with big tech first. You generally own a specific subset of the product value chain. So it could be based on the user's journey. So it's not uncommon to come across a PM who owns upgrades and downgrades, or another who owns just the authentication and the sign up and login process of the product, or maybe even a particular client, such as mobile only or web only. In fact, that may also be too broad in big tech. It's usually much narrower than that. On the other hand, at a startup, you do everything, right? So from the time the customer enters your product all the way until they're retained or churn, you generally work on and own every piece of the product value chain. And that aligns with the breadth first skill development as way, right? Because you get good, probably not great, but good at all pieces of the product stack, and develop an understanding and at least a baseline understanding of what it takes to build a product end to end. And finally, I'd like to touch upon pivoting. Like me, you might be curious about what it's like to build products on the other side of scale. And I personally think everybody should try both if you can. It's a deep education on different business problems, challenges, growth, and everything else that we talked about around skills, the job environment, and ultimately what it does for you. So, if you are planning to pivot and are looking to interview at roles that are at a company of a much different size than yours, the one takeaway I'd stress on here is this: like any good product manager, have empathy for your customer. In this case, put yourself in your interviewer's shoes, and you'll see that the most important thing on their mind would be if you have the right skills that will work in the job environment that you're applying for, right? And it makes sense. So if you are at a startup today and interviewing at big tech, make sure you have stories that highlight skills needed at a big tech company and everything else we talked about. So look at that cheat sheet that I put together. So, for example, talk about your most ambitious product stories, right? Highlight how you can think big, how you align multiple stakeholders at different levels and wrangle people. Show how you make structured decisions repeatedly. So, talk about how you make hard product decisions and assess trade offs. And vice versa, if you're in big tech looking to go into a startup, definitely expect questions around number of resources, right? So how would you deliver products frugally and with limited resources, right? So you don't have all the resources that a big tech provides, but how would you still make things happen? And how would you hit your results? How would you define KPIs? So going back to the analytical abilities that we talked about, really going from 0 to 1. So how would you even start thinking about measuring things? And really showcase how you would thrive in an environment with rapid pace to push things along and make things happen. And that's it. Thank you, everybody, for your time. I hope this was helpful. Please feel free to reach out to me on my socials or follow my newsletter. And I look forward to interacting with you during the rest of the conference. Thank you.